If you've paid any attention to the news or social media over the past few years, you've probably noticed the widespread coverage of the United States' divisive politics. How did this all begin? The story starts with understanding the two political parties that currently dominate the United States. Are you a thought monkey? If so, be sure to subscribe to stay updated with my latest videos. I spoke with two experts to learn more about what a political party is and what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican.
The old way that we think about a political party is that we have this acronym PI, PO, PIG, and that just means that there's a political party in the electorate. Those are the voters. There's a party organization. If you ask me where the Republican Party is headquartered, I would probably send you to the organization, the Republican National Committee. But there's also a party in government. So there's the legislative leaders and the president, and the same in all of the state and local governments that have parties. And so we think of the party as a composite of those three things.
So it looks as if a political party is made up of 1, voters, 2, an organization like the Democratic National Committee or Republican National Committee, and 3, the elected leaders that represent each party and hold office. But it turns out that this definition doesn't go quite far enough.
There have been some alternative definitions, including some that rely more on interest groups, that it is a coalition of groups seeking political power. And so there's a little bit of a kind of a differentiation between people who see parties as mainly about the elected officials and the candidates themselves versus political parties being about the groups of people who support those political actors and what they're trying to achieve.
We can think of a political party kind of like a nonprofit organization. Just like a nonprofit, a political party requires support from people like voters or special interest groups such as companies, rich people, or highly organized groups like the American Civil Liberties Union. Political parties therefore have an interest in serving those groups. Voters, companies, rich funders, and well-organized groups. And they try to create policy that aligns with their supporters' desired outcomes. This is why we often hear about the growing movement to get big money out of politics. It's pretty clear that special interest groups can use their power to influence the direction, rhetoric, and policy of political parties. And this movement helps shed light on the thin line between the influence of wealthy interest groups and outright corruption. The US has always been a two-party system, and for the past 150 plus years, it has been the Democratic and Republican political parties that have dominated.
Since about 1855 or so, it has been Democrats and Republicans, and pretty much everything that they've stood for has changed along the way at some point. Republicans used to be the party of big government. Now they're not. Republicans used to be a party that was more tolerant on race, that was more opposed to segregation.
On the other hand, the Democratic Party was at one time the party of white Southerners that favored expanding slavery. While it's clear that a lot has changed over time in both political parties, there has also been some consistency.
The one kind of stable through line for the parties is Democrats have generally represented the interests of poorer people in society. Republicans generally have represented the interests of richer or the merchant class. Even that's changing a little bit right now.
Throughout the world, there is something of an ideological spectrum between the left, parties of the left and parties of the right. We usually think that they're mainly divided based on economic issues, based on the extent to which the government should intervene in the economy. Normally, we think of parties competing as a right and a left, and the issues on what is defined as kind of on the right and the left change over time. And so that's why some people, don't really want to define them based on issues or positions. They want to say, well, who are the groups typically affiliated with each political party? And there you would say that the Republican Party represents America's racial majority group, a religious majority group, and the Democratic Party represents kind of a coalition of minorities, racial, religious, economic.
Generally speaking, Democrats tend to favor higher taxes for high-income earners, the expansion of social services like unemployment, more affordable health care, an increase in spending toward public education, expansion of LGBTQ rights, environmental regulation, gun control, limiting the increase in military spending, and plenty more. Republicans, on the other hand, tend to favor tax cuts for all, limited government intervention on domestic issues like welfare, are pro-life and traditional family, pro-right to bear arms, and want to increase the military budget. There are some areas where Republicans and Democrats agree. Both, for example, generally believe that education, healthcare, and Social Security are all areas that need to be improved, but they often disagree on how to address them. Interestingly enough, the political philosopher Noam Chomsky points out that in one study, the more voters learned about the Republican programs in Congress, the more they opposed the party and its congressional program. Matt explains this phenomenon.
We have an interesting pattern in public opinion where the public is actually sort of more liberal the more specific you pose a policy issue, and is more conservative the more general you pose it. So take those two examples. If you ask people, should the government spend more or less money? They say less. But if you ask people, should the government spend more or less money on K through 12 education, on healthcare for the elderly, they're in favor of more for all of those things that the government spends money on. And the same thing with regulation. If you say, should the government regulate business more or less? They generally say less. If you say, should they regulate more for environmental protection, for consumer protection, they say more.
When we think about Democrats at this point are a coalition largely of cities, and it's increasingly a coalition of people of color, increasingly look like a coalition of the college educated. To a certain extent, also a coalition of religion, or rather lack thereof. And Republicans look like the flip side of this. Republicans increasingly look like a coalition of white Americans, rural Americans, or at least Americans not necessarily near or tied to city life. If you're an evangelical, it's very likely that you are a member of the Republican Party. Those are the main differences. Increasingly, like the Democrats, if you're highly educated, less likely to join the Republican Party. At the younger level, older people, not much of an education gap. The genetics, like many other things, does play a role. The wrong way to think about this would be to think of there as being some kind of like Democrat gene or Republican gene, or maybe a little less ridiculously a liberal or conservative gene. Maybe something like that exists, but we don't think so. We know there's lots of things that do link to partisanship and ideology from genetics, and things like your genetics determines your personality. Well, we know that your personality in part seems to determine your political preferences. If you're really high on openness, if you like learning about new things, if you're very open to new ideas, that predicts you being a Democrat. If you're high on conscientiousness, you tend to be very organized, you tend to be punctual, you tend to prepare things in advance. That kind of person ends up tending to be a Republican for whatever set of reasons. So the link from genetics to party probably doesn't go directly to party, probably goes to other things like personality. It can even affect things like cognitive stuff, the brain structure. That's been shown to predict partisanship. One study shows that you're trying to interpret maybe someone with an ambiguous face. Maybe you're out in society and you're walking along and you see someone making kind of a neutral face at you, and you're trying to figure out, are they threatening or not, or what's going on with them? Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, they respond differently to that abstract, ambiguous face. Democrats are more likely to interpret the ambiguous face as someone that is struggling in some way, that needs your assistance. Republicans are more likely to interpret that ambiguous face as someone that's threatening, someone that you maybe should stay away from.
While genetics are a key component to our political preferences, it's clear that it's only the tip of the iceberg.
The biggest component is social. The people that you grow up around, your friends and family specifically, what they think, that's one big component. But also who you listen to in the media, what you turn on, what you don't. A lot of that stability and belief, stability and identity is not something that comes from within us. It's something that comes from outside of us. It's something that's reinforced by the people around us and the people that we listen to. Used to be that if I know your race, if I know your religion, if I know where you live, city versus rural, if I know regionally where you live, these things might not predict your party super well. Now, all of these things predict your party super well. And I think it's as we sort more into, there's a certain way of life in the cities, there's a certain way of life more in rural areas, there's a certain way of life in the suburbs. Those ways of life kind of tend to organize a lot of things about us. A lot of this is a story of geography. I think to a certain extent, a lot of this is a story of the media. People increasingly sort of find themselves in these echo chambers. By the time you get to the kind of end of that dynamic, a lot of people that look the same and started in this for the same reason watching that media, they now all think not just some of the same things, but all of the same things, and they don't look just somewhat alike, they look very similar.
It also seems as if Trump may have played a part in increasing this divide.
It's hard to say if Trump is the cause of this or sort of the effect of this. They're, again, probably both. Politics is a lot more conflictual. There's a lot more willingness to openly condemn one's enemies, to openly cast one's enemies in a negative light. That's something that's been changing for decades, but it's something that's really accelerated under Trump. There's also a lot less of what I might call like a shared reality. The idea that we all believe the same basic truths about what's happening in the world and what our basic goals are as a society. Being on the same page with that stuff is really important to being able to get stuff done and not be in constant conflict with each other.
Across the board, among policymakers, among organizations and activists, and among the public, we are more divided to the extent that we have a clear political side, but that does not necessarily mean that the spectrum is sort of expanding and everybody is going to the extremes. I could agree with the Republican Party in that I'm pro-life and that I'm in favor of tax cuts. And it could be that in the past, that some people would have been only in favor of one than the other. And so we'd have this differentiation. And that also might mean I only support some of the party's candidates in the past, whereas I support them all now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have extreme positions on either of those issues. What we have clear evidence for is people choosing a side and agreeing with that side across issues and candidates. What there isn't as much evidence for is that we're really moving to extremes on those individual policy issues. I do think about a kind of a move toward these kind of cultural issues and these issues of identity being more important. That's something that's happening throughout the industrialized world, has been ongoing for a while, and so we can expect that trend to continue. That doesn't mean that we lost the economic dimension. The economic dimension is still mostly what government does, but now people have aligned their economic policy attitudes with their cultural attitudes, and that's part of what's meaning that we're more divided than we were.
Yet as the US grows increasingly diverse, the Republican Party may be forced to shift their rhetoric and policy to capture a more diverse demographic.
Democrats, their coalition is basically the demographics in society right now that are growing. And Republicans, who are casting their die with a coalition of white people, a coalition of religious people, a coalition of older people, coalition of rural people, coalition of people without college degrees, that works for them now. But those are not growth industries, as we might call them. Those are all things that we expect to shrink over time. Republicans are in trouble. In order to stay competitive, maybe not now, maybe not 5 years from now, but 10, 15, 20, certainly years from now, Republicans are going to have to change the coalition of people that they back. They're going to have to find a way to appeal more to young people. They're going to have to find a way to appeal more to people of color. They're going to have to find a way to appeal more to people with college degrees.
Healing deep divides is never easy and requires enough humility to be open to ideas that differ from our own. We can thank the ad-based, engagement-driving social media networks for providing these hyper-insulated echo chambers where we, as individuals, are fed targeted, personalized content that simultaneously further unites our siloed tribal identities while further dividing us from the groups we disagree with.
Right now, we are at an all-time high in terms of polarization, in terms of heated conflict between the parties. It's gotten bad at points in history before, but this is probably as bad as it's ever gotten. This is certainly as much as it's ever gotten into the mass public, and that they've noticed how much conflict there is between the parties. What do we do about that polarization? One kind of sad answer is I think it's very difficult to do much of anything. We could try to sort of improve our understandings of one another, pushing back against stereotypes of the other side, trying better to understand where they're coming from, trying to make friends that don't necessarily look like us. But at the same time, that's really difficult because some of these issues that we disagree on deeply are issues of values, are issues of who gets human rights and who doesn't. So it's increasingly difficult to work with, get along with people on the other side. And that's something that people are increasingly experiencing.
If listening, understanding, and learning from those we disagree with is the solution, yet we find ourselves increasingly surrounded by only those we agree with, it seems like we may just be out of luck. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with my latest Thought Monkey videos. Oh my God.